Let us know the Bible by Father Claudio Doglio. The Gospel according to Mark. Mark the Evangelist. Mark is the first of the four evangelists to have composed an ordered text in which he recounts the great experience of Jesus Christ. Mark is a disciple of Peter, his collaborator. The ancient tradition presented him as Hermeneutes Petru, that is, interpreter or translator of Peter. We don't know much about him, but his name appears in the Acts of the Apostles. He was called John. Mark is a middle name. He belonged to an aristocratic and priestly family of Jerusalem. The two names, one of Jewish origin and the other of Roman tradition, indicate the double situation in which the personalities of a noble family found themselves in the Jewish world. On one hand, they persevered the traditions of their ancestors. On the other, they wanted to be open to the new world, to the new culture, to the dominant political regime of Rome. John, known as Mark, found himself living the experience of Jesus in a particular situation. Probably he did not know Jesus directly during his earthly life, but he was lucky enough to find the disciples of the first Christian community in his home. In all likelihood, what we call the house of the cenacle was his home. It was probably Mark's relatives and parents who welcomed Jesus for what would be the last Easter celebration, imminent of his arrest. There is a detail in the account of Mark's Gospel which retains a detail ignored by all the other evangelists. A small detail that could be insignificant if it were not particularly interesting. We find in chapter 14, in verse 51 and 52, during the Gethsemane scene, while Jesus is being arrested, it is said, a young man followed him wearing nothing but a linen cloth about his body. They seized him, but he left the cloth behind and ran off naked. Who is this boy? Since the other evangelists ignored this detail, what sense can it have in the overall account of the Passion according to Mark? We do not have a certain answer to these questions, but we can propose a hypothesis. And it is a likely hypothesis that the boy was Mark himself. It could be the way in which the literary author of the text signed his work. It's a way used often by artists to appear within a great work. It also applies to painters, to film directors. In this case, Mark could have wanted to underline, even though from afar I was also there. What would have happened that night? The boy named Mark watched from afar the arrival of that group of men for the Easter dinner at his house. He noticed they left late that evening. Evidently intrigued, he followed them. He had only a sheet, as he had already undressed to go to bed, a typical practice of the rich, because in ancient times, poor people usually slept dressed. Without being properly dressed, with a sheet over his shoulders, this young man follows the group of men descending stairs of a staircase that is still visible on the hill of Zion in Jerusalem. To the bottom of the Kidron Valley, then follows Jesus and his disciples on the opposite side, in the garden of olive trees called Gethsemane, where the oil mill is. As Jesus goes away to pray, the boy keeps an eye on him. Imagine the scene in an olive grove with a bright full moon in an Easter night. So the moon is full. There is a particular silence when suddenly some soldiers arrive, arresting Jesus. There is a strong uproar. The boy is hiding a little far behind some trees. Suddenly he feels a hand on his shoulder. There is a soldier who blocks him. But the young man is quick, leaving only the sheet in the soldier's hand. The young man runs away naked, returns home. And he probably doesn't say anything, except that many years later, he will recount this detail to talk about his presence in the history of Jesus. After the tragedy of his master's death, the disciples are received as guests in that house, and they remain there until Pentecost. At Easter, Jesus makes himself present to the disciples in the upper room. 50 days later, they are still there, and the Holy Spirit surprises them as guests of that house, which had practically become their headquarters and the headquarters of the first Christian community. And Mark saw the birth of the church at his home, and so he directly met Peter and the others and attended the beginning of the preaching. And if there was sympathy towards that teacher on the part of his parents, it slowly turned into faith in total adhesion. Mark, belonging to a noble, aristocratic, and priestly family, Mark must have continued his studies when he was an adolescent. We should say the study of theology or canon law in the temple school attended precisely by noble priests. Mark has fresh in his mind and heart the experience of the first Christian community. Mark has the opportunity to form himself culturally, to put his roots, but now his heart is somewhere else. His head follows the preaching of the apostles, and he himself adheres to the Christian faith. He accompanies Barnabas, who is his cousin, in a first apostolic mission. together with Paul, when he leaves Jerusalem and begins that missionary activity. There is a difficult moment during that first trip. At one point, Mark decides to stop and returns to Jerusalem. The second time, Paul will no longer want Mark to go with him. Instead, Barnabas decides to take him with him, and they leave for a new mission. If in the year 30 of the Passover of Jesus' death and resurrection, Mark is a boy of about 10 or to 15 years old, when he starts the mission in the 40s, he is a man of 20. And the following years are certainly dedicated to this apostolic mission of preaching, the proclamation of the gospel. We cannot follow him because we have no information in the Acts of the Apostles or from other sources, except that the ancient documents of the fathers testify that his literary work took place in Rome when Peter was still present, who died a martyr in the year 64. We can therefore hypothesize that Mark's literary work took place in the capital of the empire in Rome in the early 60s. When Mark arrives in the capital, together with Peter and Paul, Barnabas, Luke, Titus, Timothy, several other characters are also present. The Christian community of Rome is a lively community in the sense that it is expanding. There are new people who are welcomed into the community. But these sympathetic people must be trained. They become catechumens. That is, they enroll in the catechism. They need training to know Jesus and be able to adhere to his person. They must prepare for baptism. In all probability, the Gospel according to Mark was born as a formative text for the catechumens of Rome, a hypothesis recently presented by a Belgian scholar, a Benedictine by name Benoit Standert, sees in the book of Mark a possible Christian Easter Haggadah. His recent commentary titled it, apart from the author's name, with an ambiguous and somewhat strange formula. Mark, Gospel of one night, Gospel for life. I confess that when I saw the announcement of this publication, I did not understand this title. I had to read the book to understand and appreciate the proposed hypothesis. The night would be that of Easter. In the Jewish tradition, the Passover supper is accompanied by a story. In Hebrew, it is called Haggadah, and it simply means a story. It is a story of the departure of the Israelites from Egypt with many details added by tradition. Now, the Christian community that has preserved the link with the Jewish family has kept the Easter feast. The custom of the nocturnal celebration with a dinner that becomes the Eucharist. But on that occasion, they couldn't just read the Exodus account. It was necessary to narrate the new Exodus, that is, what had happened to Jesus Christ, and that was decisive for the new Christian faith. There was a need for a Christian Haggadah, for an Easter story that had as its center the event of Jesus Christ. This is why we can define it as a one-night's gospel, because it was probably proposed as an integral reading for that Easter supper, for that night mass on Holy Saturday, we would say now. The complete reading of this story, the Gospel according to Mark, lasts about 1.5 hours. It is the summit occasion in which the catechumens hear the story of Jesus, and at the end they give their assent and make the profession of faith. Adhere to Jesus. Celebrate Easter by descending into the waters of baptism and emerging as new creatures. The gospel of one night is delivered to catechumens so that it becomes a gospel for life. A liturgical reading of a night, but an instrument to form the whole of life. Therefore, Mark would have thought of a formative catechetical text for aspiring Christians, a text that becomes liturgical, but the function is a formative catechetical instrument. That basic text is for life, returning to the text to assimilate the mentality of Jesus Christ. On that occasion, in the early 60s in Rome, the various authorities present must have entrusted Mark with the task of drafting this text. It is possible that they chose him because he was particularly gifted with this type of literary work. However, it does not seem that Mark composed this text from the scratch. He rather reworked it. In fact, we are talking about editing. There must have been other texts, probably at least 2 collections of Jesus' teachings and actions circulating in 2 distinct Greek versions of a Semitic original composed in Jerusalem in the early years, perhaps by Matthew himself, the former tax collector who knew how to read and write. That primitive gospel of the 12 in the Semitic language was brought to the missions, to Antioch in Greece, was translated into Greek, underwent some extensions of the retouching. It had numerous additions. In Rome, in the early 60s, there were many authorized missionaries who had worked on these first drafts and were able to come up with the idea of putting together this material and giving life to a single text that would collect this apostolic preaching on Jesus. And Mark was a valid editor. He collected this material, giving a very personal nuance with small, significant, brilliant, lively editorial touches that give a particular characterization to his pages. Even if it has been said in the past that Mark is the first, therefore the closest to the facts, the most essential, we must not start from an incorrect idea of a Mark as the author of a stark chronicle. Mark intervenes in the text, and as he does his retouches, he adds meditations and is capable of first-rate symbolic brushstrokes. We return to that detail of the boy who runs away naked, leaving the sheet in the hands of the soldier. I said before that it could be an autobiographical image, but it does not take away an immense symbolic value from the detail. Imagine that full moon night among the olive trees, a soldier holding a sheet in his hand, and down into the valley a boy who runs away naked. It is an anticipation of the resurrection. On Easter morning, in the empty tomb, they will find only a sheet. The soldiers who had guarded had only one sheet in their hands, but the body of Christ ran away naked. It is a biblical theological image that refers to a passage from the prophet Amos, who announces the nakedness of baptism. The catechumens undress, go down into the water, re-emerge new, and are covered with a white robe. The autobiographical detail can take on theological and symbolic value and give the whole of this splendid, albeit brief, Gospel of Mark the connotation of a liturgical text for Easter night and a catechetical document for life.